Hey everyone. Today we're going to talk about executions. It's officially October, which means spooky season is here, and what better way to start it out than with some nice executions? Not the politics of it currently or the death penalty or anything, though that certainly could show up in a later video, but interesting methods of it historically and how they would work. I'll be trying to do this from as much of a historical, informational standpoint as possible, but let's be honest, you really just want to hear what interesting things I found on the internet, so I'll try to keep that in mind as much as I can. These will all be more unique historical methods that aren't used anymore. So your more modern classics and other methods still in use like hanging, the electric chair, lethal injection, gas chamber, firing squad, stoning, beheading, poisoning, etc. won't be talked about. Also, I won't be covering ones that have little to no historical evidence supporting them, as many of those are just outright fabrications. So, no Iron Maiden or Brazen Bull to name a few. Finally, anything just insanely gory is left out because, well, you can't demonetize someone who isn't monetized in the first place. You can derank them in search results and age restrict them, so no blood eagles, flaying, or Colombian neckties either. Wow, humans really have so many ways to kill each other, huh? Well, on that happy note, let's get started with a weird one. Immurement is certainly one of the more interesting ones on the list today, as it's hard to say whether it's one of the better or worse ones on this list, though better here is obviously relative. Immurement, which is literally Latin for walling in, is the practice of building someone into an enclosed space where, when used for execution, they are left to die of starvation or thirst. This obviously took many forms, but it seems usually most of the structure would be built already, with either the fourth wall or top of the structure, depending on the design, left open for the criminal to be put inside. Executions of this type pop up throughout historical accounts, since they would have been unique even at the time, with this method not really seeing widespread use and being heard of most commonly as a method to execute Vestal virgins of ancient Rome who had broken their vows. This actually worked quite well for that, since the virgins were considered holy priestesses and were not allowed to be physically harmed lest the goddess Vesta be angered, which would have been a big deal for the Romans. So by simply entombing them and leaving them to die of thirst, they could punish those who broke the sacred vows without technically harming them themselves. Other than this, the most famous example of immurement is probably in Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Cask of Amontillado. I think I got that right, in which an Italian man bricks up his friend, no, not like that, Zoomers, in a cellar for supposedly insulting him. It's actually not a bad story, and it's pretty short like a lot of Poe's works, so maybe check it out. But for now, it's time to move on from this method of imprisonment and also execution to another, which is a form of punishment and also execution. Keel hauling is a method of execution and sometimes punishment used on sailors who had committed the worst crimes at sea in the days of sail. The offending sailor was taken, and a rope was tied around their waist, before they were thrown overboard and dragged across the bottom of the ship by the rope, either horizontally if they wanted them to maybe live, or vertically from stern to bow, or vice versa if they wanted them to most likely not. This, to put it lightly, is not ideal, because on top of being stuck underwater for an extended period of time attempting to hold your breath, you're also being, well, hauled across the keel of a ship. The bottoms of ships in those times, and still even today to an extent, were covered in very hard and sharp barnacles, sea life, and other nasty bits that had managed to attach themselves during the vessel's journey since the last time it was cleaned, which they did have to do occasionally. This meant that, even if you didn't drown, you'd be covered in a number of bad cuts and scrapes that would not only hurt quite a bit because of the salt water, but also would most likely get infected. There were a number of different ways, such as how much slack was left in the rope, how fast it was moved, and whether the ship was in motion or stationary, that would determine whether this was more meant to be a punishment or an execution, though usually it was the latter, since the chance of death, no matter how it was done, was so great. Often, the med would end up dying after surviving the initial punishment, due to the previously mentioned high risk of infection and general lack of medical knowledge or ability at the time, especially on a ship in the middle of the sea. Regardless, it was quite a rare thing, with only rumors of it ever happening existing in the British Navy, while the Dutch Navy, during the period of their naval exploits during the Age of Exploration, had it on the books as an official method of punishment and execution, albeit more as a scare tactic to keep sailors in line than an actual recommended punishment. Nevertheless, it was on a few recorded occasions used by the Dutch Navy and slightly less reliably by pirates during the same time period, mostly as a show punishment similar to flogging but much more harsh, meant to keep the rest of the sailors in line by having them witness the terrible effects it would have on the poor soul who had to go through it, making them think twice about committing the worst crimes aboard the ship, like murder or mutiny. This naval innovation is certainly unique and grandiose, whereas the next method has a much more elegant simplicity. Defenestration. This one is a favorite of mine and has been for a long time. In middle school, this was my favorite Latin derivative, because yes, I took Latin, and yes, I had a favorite derivative. We all did, you just had to be there. Also, a derivative, in case you're unaware, is just the old word or term that gave us the term we have today. So here, the modern word defenestrate is a derivative of the Latin de fenestra. But it's not hard to see what was so appealing to my 8th grade self about the word which translates to out a window in English, and has come to mean the act of throwing someone or something out of a window. This one doesn't need much explanation, I hope, as you can probably imagine throwing something, or maybe even someone, out a window, but its origins are rather interesting. The term was officially coined in the early 17th century by the event known as the Defenestration of Prague, when 2 Catholic Church officials were thrown from the window of Prague Castle, which ended up being the spark that started the 30 Years' War and led to lots of death and destruction throughout Central Europe. Funnily enough, at least if it didn't happen to you, this was actually the 3rd famous defenestration to take place in Prague, with the first being when some town officials were thrown from the window of the new town hall in 1419, which in turn sparked what became known as the Hussite War, and led to lots of death and destruction throughout Central Europe. The second came in 1483, which actually led to an accord and 30 years of peace in the region, in a nice bit of contrast to the other two. While this method of execution seems rare historically outside of Bohemian popular uprisings, it's still an interesting one and a reminder not to piss off any locals if you ever visit what is apparently a very cool city that I'd like to see for myself, from the ground floor exclusively. Blowing from a gun, and get the giggles out now because it goes downhill from here, was the practice in which a prisoner was taken and tied with a rope to the end of a cannon so that the small of their back was covering the business end of it, at which point the cannon would be fired. Whether the cannon was loaded with an actual ball or just a powder charge varied depending on the location and time period, and it seems this is mostly because the result is similar either way when you're literally tied to the end of it. As you can imagine, or maybe would prefer not to, this isn't pretty. A first-hand account from an Englishman in, where else, India, tells us how, quote, when the gun is fired, his head is seen to go straight up into the air some 40 or 50 feet. The arms fly off right and left, high up in the air, and fall at, perhaps, 100 yards distance. The legs drop to the ground beneath the muzzle of the gun, and the body is literally blown away altogether, not a vestige being seen, end quote. Now, who, you might be asking, would be so insane as to use a method? Well, dear viewer, you may be related to them, as the Portuguese first popularized this to deal with rebels and other troublemakers in their overseas colonies, namely in Brazil and Africa and India, where it was picked up by the Mughal Empire, which used it on their rebels through the 16th and 17th centuries. Then, of course, came the British, who really took a liking to this and became the most infamous and common employers of it in their Indian colonies, starting in the mid-18th century and continuing for generations. On top of being, obviously, a very powerful statement of execution, the scattering of the body parts interfered with both Muslim and Hindu burial practices, making it doubly effective as a method of execution, as it was also a good deterrent. This was well known by the British, who partially employed it for just this reason. Now, this only scratches the surface of the things the British did in India and elsewhere, and indeed I already have a video planned on it, so don't worry. But I thought it good to give you just a little taste of what colonizers used to do to those they felt were inferior. Also, before you can go read the Wikipedia article and come back and tell me that native rulers used it too, apparently even into the 20th century in Afghanistan, the use of this absurd execution method only continued because of how infamous and often used it was by the British and Portuguese. So its continued use really just shows how ingrained it was by the original colonizers. I'm going to cap things off with another personal favorite of mine I found while researching a paper in college. This one is unique as it only ever allegedly happened once, it seems, and some of the accounts that survive may be less than trustworthy. However, it's fun and sometimes considered accurate, and that's good enough for me. The story goes that in the late 1470s, during the reign of Edward IV of England, the king's brother, George, the Duke of Clarence, was caught conspiring against the king for the second time. After having been forgiven and restored to his titles the first time, he rebelled, but doing it again, the king knew he must order his brother's execution. However, out of a kindness to their mother, he allowed his brother to choose the method of his death. George, who modern historians believe was no longer totally of sound mind after a number of events in past years, including the death of his wife, allegedly chose to be suspended upside down in a barrel of wine until dead. What we do know for sure is that on February 18th, 1478, George was indeed executed privately, but was not beheaded like most nobles would have been at the time, leading to the barely substantiated rumor of drowning in wine by his own choice, which was picked up by writers of the time who just ran with it. This may have simply been a dig at the man's reported heavy drinking throughout his life, but it regardless remains one of the most interesting possible executions of not only the War of the Roses period in England, but in the medieval age in general. Also, I know I said I wouldn't do any that weren't historically accurate, but come on. Crazy brother asks to be killed by being dunked in wine head first. I just have to make an exception for that, sorry. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this short look into some of the more interesting ways our forefathers came up with to end each other, and hopefully you've made it through with your appetite intact. It's certainly interesting how these things evolve over time, and how our perception of how barbaric or cruel something is can be tinted by both history and location where it's taking place. But that may be a bit much for someone barely coherent like myself. Anyway, let me know in the comments below what you think. Anything I missed? Something else I should have mentioned? Also, be sure to leave any tips or ideas or ways to make the videos even better. They'll certainly be appreciated. Of course, be sure to like and subscribe, and have a nice day.